I can only make this joke because I'm one of the first reviews. Sometimes, dead is better. What is going on, everybody, and welcome to my early review of Pet Sematary Bloodlines, the prequel to the remake we got a few years ago that is going to be debuting on Paramount Plus here in a couple of weeks. And I was lucky enough to check out the world premiere at Fantastic Fest here in Austin, Texas, hence the Uncle Sean background that I'm so graciously allowed to borrow for a couple of videos. So as you guys know that have been following me for a while, or news to those of you that are finding me for the first time, I am a massive fan of the original Pet Sematary film. That to me is the scariest film of all time, and just how I judge scares. The concept of, especially being a father, having to make the choice to bring your child back from the dead to try to spend time with them, whether they're going to be an evil zombie or not, is just a horrific concept that, as I've gotten older, the movie is more disturbing. And then you add in Zelda and just, yeah.
Never get out of bed again! Never get out of bed again!
That's the scariest movie for me. It's my favorite Stephen King adaptation. Was not the biggest fan of the remake from a couple of years ago. Professionally made, professional actors, really high caliber actors, but it just lost everything that made that original film so powerful and emotional and disturbing to me. And when I heard that they were going to be making a prequel to that remake to talk about a younger Judd and to focus on the Batterman family, that little story that Judd tells Lewis to kind of give the exposition of how the Micmac burial ground works, I was pretty pessimistic, to be honest with you. I'm not really a big fan of prequels, especially horror prequels. The vast majority of them tend to be very predictable. You know the fates of all the characters. The things that they decide to expand upon and answer questions about are typically things that I think are better left to be questions and to be a little bit more nondescript and something that the viewer or the reader can make up in their head. So I just didn't really have much excitement for this. But when they announced that it was going to be premiering at Fantastic Fest, I started to get a little bit more excitement, thinking that, well, maybe they've seen it, maybe there's a lot more merit to it, maybe there's some surprises in store that they feel that this is worthy of being at this festival and showing to people on the big screen. Starting off with the positives for Pet Sematary Bloodlines, I do think it's a very well directed movie. You have Lindsay Beer here as the director. She was in attendance in the festival, and there was a pretty long Q&A afterwards where she gave a lot of context to where the ideas came from, and her being a lifelong fan of the book and some things that she always wanted to explore. And I do think that whether you like what the movie is going for or not, after hearing her give context to it after seeing the movie, her vision she completely executed as a director. It's got a lot of interesting shots in it. It's got its own style. It's a very differently paced and a slightly different toned movie than the rest of the franchise, so she very much made it hers. So I think that whatever movie she wanted to make, whatever story and certain explorations that she wanted to go through, she executed it very well. There is a good bit of carnage candy in this. This might be the goriest of all of the movies. There's certainly a lot more of a body count in this one than most of the films, from what my memory serves me. So if you're a big carnage candy hound, if you want to see a little bit of a gnarlier take on the Pet Sematary lore, this one's probably going to have some entertainment value for you. And finally, tying in with the title of Pet Sematary Bloodlines, this movie takes a little bit of a different angle in exploring the familial bond and the ties of blood relatives. Where previous iterations of this story and the novel is focusing more on the grief and the tragedy of losing a loved one and how far would you go to get them back, and like how powerful is grief? Is it going to play with your morals? Are you going to just completely lose all sense of yourself just to get one more minute with this person? And Pet Sematary Bloodlines tends to lean a little bit more into kind of the burden of family, like the history, your ancestors, your bloodline, the sins of the past. Like, how responsible are you for what your ancestors, your father, your grandfather did? How much of that burden should lay on you? Is it a responsibility, or is it something that you should try to run away from? And so I think that was an interesting thing to explore, to kind of give the other side of the coin of the ties of family. But moving on to the negatives, this movie was 100% what I expected it to be, and that's not a good thing. It has all of the pitfalls of horror prequels, to where 90% of the story, the skeleton of where things are going to go. You know most of the events, especially if you're a big fan of Pet Sematary. You know characters' fates. You can see the writing on the wall with where things are set up and where they're eventually going to end up in the climax for the most part. And it just kills a lot of the tension, a lot of the mystery, a lot of the investment in certain characters, because you just look at all these people and go, well, they're not in the Pet Sematary movie, so they're probably going to die. And that horror experience has always been really impacted by that in prequels for me. That's why most of them I don't tend to care for. And it also makes the mistake of answering questions that I was never asking, and some of the answers they give I don't particularly care for. That's why more times than not I tend to lean on wanting things to be a little bit more ambiguous and not spelled out for you, because all of the different iterations of different fans, different viewers, of how they see things and what their preferred lore is, what their preferred answers are, is always more interesting to me than giving a definitive answer. The other large problem with the film is that this is focusing somewhat on that story of Timmy Baterman that is told in the original movie and the novel, and I believe there was a scene in the remake, I haven't seen it in a long time, where it's the father that has the son that comes home from Vietnam who was killed, and he buries him, and then the kid turns murderous and zombified, and the town burns his house, and the little tiny bit of exposition that we get in the original movie and the novel, it's effective in that little small sense because it tells you everything you need to know about the effects of the Pet Sematary and the Micmac burial ground. And in this movie, they just start the movie after that decision has already been made by Baterman's father. You have David Duchovny here playing the dad. The movie opens up with everything already been set in course, and so it kind of loses that core element of what makes the Pet Sematary experience and what makes that story so haunting to me, which is that lingering question of what would you do? Have I gone too far? Have I made a mistake? And the parents' slow realization that they have made this horrific mistake and whatever came back was not what they put into the ground. That is entirely removed here. And to a degree, I understand they don't want to go through the same motions. They don't want to tell the same exact story. But when you remove that from the story and you just focus on a younger Judd, whose characterization is essentially just kind of a curious kid that's trying to get out of town and doesn't really know anything about the Pet Sematary or the sins of the past or the history of the town, and he just slowly starts to figure out things are a little off in town, it just loses that very integral emotional devastation element that makes Pet Sematary to me. So by default, what you're left with is a movie that feels so much more generic and so much more familiar to other franchises than the franchise that actually is borrowing the name and the lore and the story and the characters from. There's also, because of that, much less of a focus on the psychological horror and the disturbing elements of Pet Sematary, and it leans much more onto jump scares and zombie action. Like the third act is much more of like an action siege type thing than what you would typically expect from Pet Sematary. And some people might like that, but to me it just kind of felt foreign. It almost felt like it wasn't a Pet Sematary film. And just the tone and the pacing of it felt off from what I want and what I expect from this franchise. And it's one of the reasons why I've always gravitated towards that original film, because the scare factor in that is psychological to me. It's something that sticks in your brain. It's something that actually haunts you, of that question, those possibilities, and the moral quandary of the subject of the book, not jump scares. And that's, for the most part, what this movie has to offer. There's at least two scenes where somebody goes to give that classic line of sometimes dead is better, and when they get to the the truck goes by and there's your jump scare. And there's, even when you get to the more zombie action stuff, like it's just jump scares. It's people coming out at you with a loud boom, and you can have really effective jump scares. There are a number of them that are some of the best scares in horror history, but when you have a movie that almost entirely relies on that, that's almost always a turnoff for me. Something that I imagine is going to be very divisive in this movie, which I'm glad I stayed for the Q&A, got a little more context from the director. There are certain creative liberties taken with the backstory and the lore of how the Micmac burial ground works, and like how it affects this town and the people in the town, that are very much ideas of the director and how she interprets the novel, how she interprets the source material, which is cool. You should make it your own. But the context that she gave in the Q&A for kind of directly ignoring and sidestepping a very integral piece of the novel that has yet to be explored in any of the movies, is that she kind of said, when I read the novel and I wanted to do a different take on this story, I kind of chose to frame that as that being like a lie that the townspeople gave. That's something that was not entirely truthful. And so my version goes in a different direction and dismisses that entirely. I'm paraphrasing the hell out of this, but there is an integral element to the novel that a lot of fans have been waiting to see get explored in the movies that is yet again not explored here, and goes as far as to pretty much retcon that out of the novel. Can't give any context to what that is, but I could see some hardcore fans being a little pissed. I also found the acting to be very dry in this one, and it's a shame because there's a number of actors here that you're going to recognize. You got Henry Thomas in here, you got David Duchovny, you got Pam Grier. Pam Grier does have a badass classic Pam Grier line that was kind of the highlight of the movie to me, oddly enough. But everybody just kind of has this subdued, quiet, unemotional performance, and I don't know if that was the way they were directed. I don't know if that was a lack of interest on their part. I don't know if that was just them trying to kind of have the characterization of this town, of just trying to drift through life, keeping this secret. I'm really not sure, but the whole movie, all the performances kind of had the same pace, the same beat to them, and there wasn't any life to any of it. Even the young actor that plays Judd, who I found out afterwards is Katie Seagal's son, he just didn't capture Judd to me. Like, Judd is an interesting character, much more so in the original film, Fred Gwynn's version. I love John Lithgow, but Judd is an interesting character because of his quirks, because of his eccentricities, because of these, really backwoods Maine elements that character brings that makes him stand out. And none of that is present in this version of the character. He's just a regular old 20-something, and it just didn't have any pop to him to merit him being the lead of the movie and the character that we are experiencing this story through. Going along with that, little nitpick, why does nobody have a Maine accent in this movie? Like, I can't remember if John Lithgow had one. I don't believe he did, so I guess it makes sense that the younger Judd wouldn't, but nobody has it. That's a key element for me. That's a nitpick, but that's important. And my final negative is that when you get into the third act, there's a number of things that feel like they kind of come out of nowhere, almost as if there are scenes cut out of the film that give more context to certain things. There are characters that end up in one place that we just directly cut to, that you get no context for how they got there or why they are there, and it's very confusing for the entire sequence that they are in the place that they are in. There are certain ticking time elements added to the third act that don't completely make sense and aren't even really executed in the way that a ticking clock element should be utilized to kind of add tension to a climax. There are certain things that happen where a character is put in a spot where they are in direct danger and they can't move, but the way that it's framed, you're like, that's not a direct danger whatsoever. You could very easily get out of that. I don't buy that being something that impedes this character. So that was almost all exclusively in the third act. I genuinely think there's probably about 10 to 15 minutes that was cut out of this film that probably would have made the film a little bit more coherent as you transfer into the climax of the movie. So overall, guys, unfortunately, I was not a big fan of this movie. If you're a Pet Sematary fanatic, it's probably worth checking out on Paramount Plus when it debuts to see if some of these a little bit more creative liberties work for you. I'm sure there's some people that are really going to enjoy the different takes and the different tones and the different approach that they take to Pet Sematary. For me, I guess I'm a little bit more of a purist in what I come to this franchise for, what I value this franchise for. This movie didn't really deliver for me, and the extra story that we get, the exploration of things in the past, did nothing to add to my love, my understanding, and my appreciation of Pet Sematary. So unfortunately, this was just a big swing and a miss. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2023 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my review of the original Pet Sematary up here. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my further coverage of the films that I'm seeing in Fantastic Fest or anything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.